This podcast is a production of Unfiltered Studios. If you would like to know more about joining Unfiltered Studios, please visit our website at unfpod.com for more information.
And now, here's a word from our sponsor.
Spartacus Coffee is made for and made by hustlers, entrepreneurs, peak athletes, self-starters, and free thinkers. Our community of coffee drinkers believe in lifting each other up to be the best version of ourselves we can be. On top of that, every sale goes to the nonprofit organization No Kid Hungry, a national effort to end childhood hunger in America. To learn more about that and order some of the best, richest coffee you can find at an affordable price, go to SpartacusCoffee.com and be sure to use my promo code. It's pretty simple. It's JBurke, which is JAYBURKE, and get 10% off your first order. Remember, Spartacus Coffee. We fuel the grind, we fuel the success, we fuel champions. We are Spartacus.
And now back to your regularly scheduled program.
The thing about mythology is it reveals timeless human concerns. From life and death to morality, offering insights into ancient societies and serving as a moral guide. These enduring narratives also inspire art and advertising, tapping into universal themes across cultures and generations. And for this episode, there was nobody better in mind to talk about this than Chelsey Turpening Coxsey, who you may remember from our Sleeping in Dreams episode. But at its heart, this episode's really a friendly chat between Chelsey and I about why these old stories still matter to us today. It looks into how these ancient tales help us understand our feelings, who we are, and our place in the world. And I can't lie to you, this was one of my favorite discussions I've ever had on the show. It's exactly the type of deep dive into a subject that splinters off into a million different directions, which I often promise because I know myself. But it really feels like just two friends sitting down, trying to uncover the hidden meanings in stories that they heard from long ago and still fit into our lives right now. But find out for yourself in an episode I'm calling Bridging Worlds, the Power of Myth in Modern Society with Chelsey Turpening Coxsey.
Watch out, you might get what you're after. Cool, baby, strange but not a stranger. I'm an ordinary guy, burning down the house.
Hello and welcome to the With Jay Burke Show. My name is Jason Burke, and though I'm technically the host of this podcast, it's the guests who truly take top billing. This is a place for curious minds who enjoy civil and sometimes meandering conversation. If you appreciate a few laughs and want to come away with new knowledge about subjects that aren't always easy to break down, then you're the person I want listening to this podcast. Today, I get the pleasure of speaking with Chelsey Turpening Coxsey again. Chelsey is a dream analysis coach who explores dreams as metaphors for inner truth. We discuss how myths have long served a similar role as collective dreams expressing humanity's deepest nature. Though different in form, myths and dreams both speak symbolically. Dreams reflect the psyche's inner myths, while cultural myths give shape to mankind's greatest hopes and fears. Myths grapple with love, courage, meaning, all of life's timeless mysteries. They transport us beyond the everyday as dreams do each night. In other words, myths are the dreams we dream together. Chelsey, welcome back.
Hi. That was amazing, by the way. God, I love how you did that. I'm glad to be back. This is going to be a fun conversation.
I had to try to tie them together somehow.
Love it. You're great at it. No, that's beautiful. I love
Thank
that.
you.
And it's interesting because the mythology and all that, it really does correlate a lot with the human psyche, what we experience in our daytime, as well as you were saying, projecting it into humanity as a mass collective.
Yeah, definitely. And this is a subject that you can really go almost anywhere with. We still live with many of the myths that started out a long time ago. They are a way for us to deal sometimes with the unknown.
Yeah. It's always an expression that someone has been through or experienced, or it's an emotional thing. And it gets quite complex. There's some history sometimes in these too, but I've noticed as it progresses, it seems to be very much a human psychological processing. It is a bit of a map that when you view it that way, it's like then, or we're not the first people to experience these emotions or these hurdles internally, that it's been going on for all of humanity on an individual scale and a mass collective. And, you're not alone in this stuff. And I do love how it's very story-like with the expressions too.
How did you get into myths? I know you're big into psychology. Did that naturally lead you there?
So it was history was a lot, and I was studying world religion, spirituality, different cultures, but I wasn't starting with the modern day stuff. I really love like ancient history. So I was doing a lot of like primitive man studies at the time, and I realized how important the stories were to some of the most earliest cultures. I really enjoyed how it progressed from primitive man's history and into culture and societies and how we express certain things. So I was really big into shamanism along with primitive man. And then it led me from shamanism to mythology. There was a lot of history. I love history a lot.
I love history. So I'm a big U.S. history person. But I mean, I love history in general. It's just sometimes it's so vast. I'm like, where do I even go? Because you could get into like Asian history is fascinating too. But that's so long. And obviously Europe has its own history. And, it's fun to look at putting together a puzzle and seeing how everything goes together. My friend who comes on, he's a history teacher, and he'll talk about it. He calls history, it's a web, and it's just interconnecting. And early myths had a lot of influence on current religions that we have now. It's just trying to figure out where we belong in the cosmos. Although they didn't know the cosmos, they just saw the sky and tried to figure out what was going on up there.
Yeah. Wanting to connect to something bigger than us, to not feel alone in the world. Extremely lonely, very survival mode. And that's why I really like it, Primitive Man specifically, because it shows humanity at the rawness and then how it progressed from there. And the first things we see is even shamanism and how it was this, like one specific individual that really had some internal connection to what they felt was the universe or the spirit world and the nature around them, really. And I think it really progresses from there, like into mythology too. Though I do feel like mythology was around even before primitive man, maybe with older ancient cultures like Lemuria, Atlantis, all of that. They have a lot of things that were lost. So I feel like some of those stories did get carried over to primitive man, if that makes sense. I see primitive as you're in survival mode, and it's like the world was kind of wiped out before or in a phase.
Yeah, well, back to what the paleo period or whatever you want to call it. That's actually really interesting too, because we actually really don't know where all this came from. We had the biggest library that burned down in Alexandria, and we lost like 90% of all history. So when you think about that, it's patchwork as to how far we can go. I think I read somewhere that we've only recorded like 7% of our history.
Wow. Such a small number. But I believe it, because when you think throughout history, people are always going to war, destroying cultures, destroying history. It was very selfish. We've lost a lot of history and books and libraries through those times, and it's sad. It's by the hundreds and thousands of different wars that just slowly depleted.
Well, there's the wars, and then a lot of oral history, and who knows what changed over time with that.
Yeah, and I feel like that's how mythology came about. It was all word of mouth, really. Campfire stories, talking and sharing, exploring. I'm sure the game telephone takes place after a while a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I grew up in the Catholic church. I was a Catholic schoolboy for a while. I was always a questioner, though. They didn't like that. I'd be like, that makes no sense.
Baptist, same thing.
And then a lot is all oral tradition until the Romans decided to finally get everything together. In 300, they had that council. They put the books together. There was a bunch of stuff all over the place. But a lot of the early stuff was all just oral tradition.
Yeah, or like individual people's writings that they had to gather up. Are you talking about the Council of Nicaea, right?
Yes, I couldn't think of the name of it.
Yeah, they were only around just long enough to build the Bible, and then they didn't exist after that. It was crazy when I looked up the history on like how long they were about, and I was like, it's wild. But there were more books in the Bible at first, and I feel like different branches kind of picked and chose a little bit what they wanted to be actually be in their Bible, or what seemed like it was too questionable or didn't suit it right. But so like some of those lost books of the Bible are really interesting too, actually.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
like 13 of them.
Yeah, the Gnostic scripts or something like that. Back in the day, I read a lot of them. There was the book of Judas, actually, was really interesting. I don't know if you've seen that.
Haven't read it, but I would love to talk
All right.
about it.
I didn't read it, but I did. I watched something on it. It's so interesting because Jesus basically says that the God you're worshiping is the wrong God. It's actually the devil who fooled you into worshiping him. He trusted Judas with that. You know, it was interesting to look at it that way, because when you think about like false idols and things like that, we have so many of them, but that would probably be the way it would work.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, those are very interesting.
I need to read it now.
I think there's other ones too. The Gnostic are the big ones. There was a whole slew of them.
And I like Gnostic ideas in general. The Trinity ideas of like how mankind came about. They talk about some really interesting concepts. But like, I think one of the oldest Christian branches would have been the Ethiopian Catholics. And I think they were like very mystic, and they had a lot more magic involved with their views. And then of course, throughout time, it got a lot was washed out or watered down. But, you know, Christianity in general is interesting. But again, it kind of just still rooted into like mythology still at some of the core.
Yeah, I think it borrows a lot from Zoroastrianism, which was around like 2,000 years before Jesus. It's almost the same story.
To kind of go off of what we're talking about now, my childhood pastor growing up was my godfather. He died like a year ago, but I was picking his brain like crazy while the last couple of years he was alive. And he had said at one point, he actually was worried that maybe the church was not kept as sanctified as everyone thought it was. And what if you are actually going for the bad guy, even though he had a good relationship? And I think it was personal, but I think when you look at history and stuff like that, it makes you wonder, like, was it really kept purified the whole time? Because the one thing that would want to be infiltrated to control the masses would be the belief systems, naturally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always been used as a tool. I mean, I don't have these issues with belief, to be honest with you, but a lot of times it's the actions they lead to that bother me. A lot of what people talk about with, you know, Jesus or any of the other prophets is probably a good way to live your life. But nobody seems to live their life according to them. They talk about it, but I don't see it a lot. I see a lot of judgment.
I think it's because sometimes feeling the idea of something externally saving you is the lazy way out, where Jesus and a lot of these people were processing and going through the journey physically, and they were becoming the product versus just maybe allowing something externally, giving them a hall pass a tad bit.
That's a great point. I didn't think of it that way. Doing the inner work is the hard thing.
Yeah.
Leaving it up to something out there is much easier.
Yeah, you're like, all right, cool. I can be an asshole today if I want to. I'm still saved.
That's what I used to talk about all the time. I used to be like, you mean when I'm about to die, as long as I'm really sorry, I could still go to heaven? And they're like, well, no, you have to like legitimately be sorry. And I'm like, but if like the last minute of my life I'm legitimately sorry, I could still go.
Yeah, you're
like, I'll see you later.
Be a terrible human the whole process and still make the cut miraculously. It's interesting because people will talk about spirituality, and I love spirituality a lot. I think it's organic in the journey and process of actually trying to do the work. But I do see how a lot of people are not seeking their soul and their internal story and wisdom from this, and they're just seeking external. So at that point, it doesn't matter if you're seeking spirituality externally or religion, because if you're just grabbing externally outwards to have a lifeboat, but you're not going internal to grab it, I think you're missing the point a little bit. You got to go into yourself. And I think that's where the mythology or the inspiration of mythology comes from, is going internally to yourself. And it's weird. It's a little trippy, but it's very much a mythological experience in your own psyche.
Yeah. Like you said, it all connects. I think it's hard today because society's built for the external anyway. There's just things built to take your attention away. Money is definitely Well, money to me is God, capital, whatever you want to call it. And that's just based on something external. There's nothing intrinsic about that.
Yeah.
I don't think we do a good job. I never thought this with children, especially in teaching them to look inward more. I think kids should be taught to process emotions and question things and just develop a sense of I don't want to say who they are, because who you are changes throughout your whole life. You're never who you are.
Yeah.
We do a bad job of teaching kids, the thing we always teach kids is like, you have to do this. You can't ask questions or talk back to authority. And this is how society is structured, and this is how it should work for you. And, I do think that there's some questioning to that at this point. I think, during the COVID period, I think I saw that a little more when people were allowed to think a little bit, be home and think for themselves a little bit.
Even though they were stressed. I'm sure it's still stressful, but no, it's like they're killing the genuine curiosity.
Yeah.
Because one of the things I know is when I'm in the student chair, which I'm often always in the student chair, I'm always a student, and I'm always very curious. I want to know more, but I'm seeking externally too, but I'm also trying to seek internally as well, and have it be this relationship that cycles about, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a genuine curiosity, and it definitely makes me feel childlike. And I don't think that should ever be diminished or pushed away, because curiosity is important in life. It makes you question things, seek deeper, kind of get on some of these rabbit hole conversations sometimes too.
Yeah.
It's funny. They say curiosity kills the cat. Did it really? Or they just don't want you to be curious?
They don't want you to be the curious cat, I think. No, I agree with you. The best thing you can do is just know that you probably don't know much. No matter how smart you are, you really don't know anything.
Anyone that tells me they know it all sounds like such an idiot. I would never say that.
I think that's how you keep an open mind, is just kind of knowing that there's just more to know. For me, that used to be sometimes a problem, though, because I would be unsure of things. I almost was too open, where I had no opinion at all about certain things, because I was like, I don't know if I really know that.
I think that would be a foundation thing almost. There's certain things that you can lean on as a foundation and build up on that. You may not be able to control how it evolves, but this, and this makes a good foundation. From there, you get a lot more from it. But it sucks though when you're killing your belief systems, because you're basically tearing up the foundation too. So it's its own process.
I know. I get it. It's so stressful. Well, it could get a little dark too when you get there. It's almost like you're breaking it down to nothing, and then you're like, well, what does anything mean? It's
a good question though. Question that brings foundation whenever you get some answers from it.
Well, I decided to make meaning. I had to look at it from the standpoint of, and I'm not saying it's meaningless or there's nothing out there or whatever, but if there was, the beauty is you get to make it.
Yeah.
You get to decide what is.
I think that's awesome.
That's a great place to be.
And that's a great foundation to view a lot of things when you're trying to be open-minded and pull into new concepts or to learn.
Well, so honestly, a lot of these myths deal with meaning and death and the afterlife and life, because there were a lot of birth meanings, or fertility was big in 8000 BC, where you're talking about the earth and plants and the cycles of life and cycles of nature. And it feels more natural when you think about stuff like that, the cycle of life.
Yeah, it's a very shamanic concept too. If we want to really dig deep without going too externally in books and knowledge, if you really wanted to know some answers to the basic things of life, you just watch the ecosystem naturally around you.
Mm.
It teaches a lot.
I say that all the time. We don't live in balance. I guess there are a lot of Buddhist teachings about that with balance. And, when I look at nature, we don't live within nature. We don't live within the means. The Native Americans, I love the way they viewed life, and they would kill an animal, but they'd use all of it, and they were very respectful about it because it was sustenance and it gave them life. That was important to them. Then I look at things we factory farm now, and it's so, against.
We lost our touch a little bit, or our blush.
Yeah. Like I said, we definitely go against what nature wants. But nature's a weird thing too, because people, when they think about nature, they think about being in the woods or being outside, and it's like really nature's just a part of you.
We exist in the ecosystem if we are in denial of it or not. We are a part of nature as well. We're just kind of a bit arrogant, separating ourselves from it so much in the laws of it, as well as how we treat it and we involve ourselves in it. That's why I like Primitive Man, because it talks about like even the hunting, and even though they had to survive and eat, they didn't know how to like grow gardens and work with the ground yet. So they were strictly hunting, right? It was hard for them, let alone did they not only feel disconnected from the universe and the world around them, they also felt disconnected from nature. And when they had to hunt animals, like it kind of hurts a little bit, but you need to survive. That's why you always would see old school paintings and artistic work where there would be a man with an animal mask in the hunting tribe, but he didn't have any weapons. He was the shaman who made it very spiritualistic, and it really brought closure to primitive man to survive the way they had to in nature. It's interesting because I don't think I've ever seen a snake cry over eating over a mouse.
Well, that's true. When you talk about the arrogance, it's partly like we have the curse and the luxury of knowledge, right? I mean, we're of awareness, I guess is what I'm talking about, where there's no other species who has that. They don't have the awareness. They just have a natural way of working within nature, their own hierarchy, and it's natural law. The only time it's unnatural is when we get involved. Even like sometimes when you hear things like in Florida, people would buy boa constrictors and then toss them into the swamps or wherever they are out there, and they just destroy the whole ecosystem.
The whole ecosystem's wobbled up.
It's like there was a natural order there, and it just gets totally, totally messed up.
Yeah.
We have awareness, and that's both a gift and a curse, I always think.
We're consciously a little bit higher up on it in our own way. But at the same time, I think animals can be very conscious, but they do have that animalistic behavior that we seem to like transcend. So it's, we are the keepers in a way,
right,
for this planet. And it's like, it comes down to us and our responsibility to see where we are in that place and make it better. We're supposed to garden the earth, not necessarily destroy it or pollute it.
Well, I think that's where myths and modernity kind of met, right? Older myths had a lot to do with balance in nature or balance with the cosmos or whatever you want to call it. Whereas modernity, even modern religions, the way they're viewed now, a lot of them, it's always humans are the centerpiece of it. And when you take a really, really far perspective, and you start going outside of where you live, look at it from the view of the sky, and then get into the cosmos, you're nothing. You're just you're not even a speck.
You're like this tiny little...
Yeah. But at the same time, you're very important to it in some way. Everybody just is a part of it. Everything feeds off of each other. Everybody just plays a little part into moving it forward to wherever it's going.
Yeah. Always kind of viewed us as like blood cells, or Earth would be one neuron of a very large system, off of like how the brain works or like the body. We are one tiny little thing, a part of a very large system universally. It's like, maybe we're tiny little somethings that make a neuron as a planet.
See, I think we think of it the same way. I always say we're just a tiny cog in a big machine, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't say like there's nothing. I can't believe that there's nothing out there. I mean, we came from something. So there's, to believe you go into nothingness is a little too much for me to take. But I think I've said it before. I don't know what God is or who God is or whatever. But yeah, I think we're just a tiny part of a big machine. And I like the way you put that, right? Like, do your atoms and cells know are they part of their own world and don't even really know? There's not an awareness of us.
Yeah. At this point, my internal system is just functioning as it is. Is it aware of me? Are we aware of the bigger one that we're probably a part of?
Yeah.
It makes sense with the internal family system concepts, which is the idea that we have our own internal family system of all these different aspects that make up us. And then as a society, we're an external, large scale family system. And it just keeps going. And he keeps taking this idea and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And you're like, at what point does it end? And you're like,
yeah, I know. Like, where does this go?
it just keeps going.
Was he religious at all? Or because he does talk about like cultures.
His family was very religious. I believe his mom was the daughter of an alchemist, and he's had 2 grandparents that were pastor, or his dad and his grandpa were a pastor. So he grew up with it, but he was more spiritualistic and he challenged a lot of the concepts. His last 2 books that published later, way after his death, were the Red Books and the Black Books. They're basically his journals. And he had suggested that he didn't want them published while he was alive. He wanted his family in the future to publish it when the world was ready for it. And yeah, it gets really metaphysical. And he loves mythology, and he talks about a lot of that stuff too, on a psychological aspect as well as a metaphysical. So I see it a little bit as both. I do believe that mythology represents history and the human psychology. So like I find the most earliest forms of mythology to be really interesting, because when I read some of them, I'm like, God, this feels like history, like a really weird history. And I'm like, okay. And that's when I'm like, okay, mythology can get weird. It can bring in some aliens a tad bit, or different races not from Earth, but interacting with Earth. Like even Odin's a popular one. They're not like him and his Greek mythology aspects. They're not, or not Greek, but from the far north, Norway, I think. Yeah, they seem very alien-esque, like in a way. Maybe they weren't. I don't know what they looked like, but the idea that they're not from Earth, but they're interacting with Earth, teaching things, and somehow sharing it with people in those time periods. And God is such a weird term because people use it very loosely.
Right.
What were they really trying to describe at that point?
I think I read something like all those types of myths when you're talking about Odin. That's Norse mythology?
Yeah.
Okay. That was more of making the cosmos and the celestial bodies much more relatable humans, you know?
Like with a personality and existence.
Yeah, exactly.
And I have heard that before, like, because even the planets kind of appear to have their own thing, or the gods have a thing with the planets, which would make sense because people are staring at them and tracking it, pulling the symbolism and how it represents to you on a personal level.
Think about that sometimes, too, if you were alive then, and to see something as wondrous as lightning strike, you know? It's weird because I think mythology birthed science a little bit.
Yeah, it was like a way to express it before you knew what it was.
Yes, exactly. It's like questioning it and then giving it some kind of meaning, and then you study it and it gets deeper. But, you know, I can imagine when people say they used to worship the sun or things like that, I could totally see that. It was the stuff that kept you alive. You know, when it went away, you're probably like, what did I do?
I know. A lot of religions express the nature around them in a systematic way that comes off like God or goddess-like, because it holds a high importance to your well-being or being alive. Egyptians did that a lot with the nature.
You were talking about the Egyptians, and those are times, though, that get interesting with their myths, because it's kind of like what the Romans did, even when we talk about changing Christianity around. It's kind of creating a hierarchy or order, a social and political order with it. Myths turning into religion and justifying this stuff gave kings the divine rights that they had over classes. And it's funny, I didn't really think about it till we were just talking about all that stuff, but they're so influential in so many fields. I mean, think about them littered in the arts and psychology or anthropology. They're like the basis for almost anything when you think about it.
Yeah, it really is. That's why it's one of my favorites. It's very important. And, like, I know other cultures, like, even beyond, like, before that, I think Sumerians were before Roman culture. Mm-hmm. And they had a big shift as well with some of their belief systems that really were pivotal, going from mythology, you know, more of a more modern religious state, too. But I always heard some weird stuff with the way that theirs came about, which would get into the idea that they were influenced by, like, mm-hmm. this god or someone that had taught them something that was skewed or kind of twisted up in a negative way and started. So like I've heard that like it didn't go wrong in Egypt. It went wrong with the Sumerians in some way. I've heard a lot of people say like and I'm not like huge with the Sumerian history. I've come across it plenty of times, but I realize that there's something that definitely got twisted up at that point, and it like kind of branched out and affected a lot of regions around the world, really, and throughout history, and how they would view themselves existing in the universe, and to even have a god and all that. It gets kind of weird, like Alien a bit again. It's always like, it's a hard one not to talk about because obviously we don't exist in this universe by ourselves. So it's like, what is some of this exterior influence? We're not to have an alien conversation, but mythology brings these things up, and
listen,
we're like,
I love this. So
are we just the dumb toddlers of the universe falling for all this crap?
I don't know. So I always say, see, here's my problem. So I don't disbelieve in life being out there. It's just so vast. I mean, you think at some point the conditions are right for life, or life will adapt to it. And my only problem is the people who aliens always tend to kidnap are the most like rudimentary. I hate saying it like that. It's like take smart people, and it's always like people,
some weirdos. There's a lot of interesting stories with it. I also feel like a lot of people have been having different experiences. And for me, when I look at mythology, I see it on a lot of layers. I feel like as like a planet Earth, have been experiencing this for a long time in a positive and negative way. So like, I'm sorry to keep taking like maybe some of the dumb people, but I don't think that would be necessarily in a positive benefit for us, maybe more in a manipulative way. But I do know that there's some really interesting stories with brilliant people too. And it's just like really crazy. But at the same time, when I look back at mythology, I see just like how, okay, again, we're trying to figure out how we exist in the world. And there's these gods and goddesses. And I do believe that it exists like an archetype within ourselves. But then I look at it on the mass collective too. And I'm like, what experiences are some of these stories coming through? And it's just, I don't know, but it is really interesting. So like for the most part, I do view it from like a internal aspect, because like you see like the savior character a lot, the hero, you see how the journey and all the characters come into play, and it's repeated throughout culture. So that's very internal, I think, on a psychological level. But then some of the older mythology stuff, that's the stuff that I'm just like, where'd that come from? It's not like the modern stuff everyone's mostly familiar with. It's the old mythology, and you're like, what's going on with this?
You're right. It gets a little weird. Like, so there's a story at play all the time. I mean, you can take the hero's journey and look at that, and that's really repeated throughout all of the modern myths. But there's some weird shit that goes on before we figured all that stuff out, I think. And it actually it's very telling of whatever time it was. You know, when you listen to like some of the old stories they used to tell, you know, like Little Red Riding Hood was a story that when we lived in these little societies just was to teach kids not to go into the woods. Some of those old stories don't translate they don't age very well, but I guess they fit with the times as far as they were trying to teach.
And that makes a lot of sense too, because each generation or each time of era in history does have its unique voice. The evolution of language is always changing. They express a lot of stuff creatively through story, which I feel like is like a natural subconscious aspect, because the conscious part couldn't necessarily grasp. How do I share what I'm trying to say here, or what I may have witnessed or experienced? So that's why I love the complexities of mythology. And I feel like it's very relatable still today. I'm a little sad about modern day society because I think we're a little too disconnected from that stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think it does show a lot just in our religious systems, but also how we treat the ecosystem and exist in it. We were trying to learn our place within it. And now it's like we've kind of unlearned it a little bit and created our own little hyper bubble of society, and got very complex.
Well, that's where, you know, that's where I say our awareness is occurs. It puts us on the top of the food chain. And it's very easy to look at the beautiful stars and, you know, a dark sky, but not think twice about the species that are stomped out or the land that's been used up or polluted. View things in relation to ourselves. And then it's hard not to once you have that awareness. We might be like almost too aware of things in some way. A lot of people are blind to the fact that there's way more out. I mean, reality is whatever. When I think about vision, that's just the way the light reflects your eyes and the way your brain makes it work. And that's fucking weird because who knows if me or you are seeing the same thing.
It makes it unique.
Right.
That's how I say people would perceive reality or even metaphysical experiences, everything around them, even emotionally. We do have our own reflection or the own angle of the reflection in our own way.
Yeah. And then it's different for humans too because you throw emotions into it and it's just a whole different game.
Oh, yeah. It's funny because your thoughts create your reality. Your emotions create thoughts. So it's a vicious cycle when it's kind of out of control.
But again, that's a weird thing too, right? Do you create the thoughts or do the thoughts just you? So there's always this thing with neuroscience. And, you know, I've heard some, you know, people will be like, I'm a bad person because I had this thought. And it's like, well, you don't really control your thoughts. They come and you have a little bit of authorship on it, but it's really just dependent on so much that's out of your control. Thoughts can come into your head because you got a bad night's sleep. You woke up and you stubbed your toe. That changes your frame of reference and your frame of mind. And I don't know. It's weird. You know, as I was listening to a podcast and it took me a long time to get what this guy was saying, but he was talking about actually don't have free will whatsoever. Which I think is a really weird thing to say.
Yeah.
I understood what he was saying after an hour of listening to him. And a lot of people would disagree with him. But his thought was more like, you're the sum of a bunch of chemical reactions always going once, right?
Yeah.
And your reaction might be based on, you know, at that moment it was built up from the time you were in your mother's womb and maybe she was a nervous wreck and you just bathed in her anxiety. You know, it's like, it's so weird.
Makes sense,
and when you think about like epigenetics or whatever, right? You're taking all your ancestors with you every time you're born. You're taking all their experiences too.
Yep.
That was kind of like his point. You're just the sum of everything that happens. And I don't know how I feel about that, honestly, but I understand where he's coming from.
I like it because when I describe how the subconsciousness works, it relates a lot to what he was saying. The idea that the subconsciousness takes in a bunch of data and information constantly, and it will put it back out, project it in your reality, or use it. So the idea that if you are not cleaning house, taking care of your mind, it will create internal reactions and emotions, release chemicals in your body, which creates a lot of stuff from there. So when we view the subconsciousness like that, that totally makes sense. That's why I liked one of the books that I read, and I know there's a lot of this topic's been around for a while, so it's not just Joe Dispenza, but that was the book I had read that really helped me kind of get control of my depression a couple of years ago. And it was the idea that our thoughts create the releases in our body, the chemical releases, and how do we break the habit of being yourself? It was the idea of consciously diving into your subconscious, trying to heal certain things. And yes, a lot of it was generational too. So it's like, not only are you, it's anything you would have experienced that has been stored in your subconsciousness. And there's it's a very large computer system.
Yeah. I mean, so
I don't know how many file cabinets we could compare it to, but I'm sure it's in the
well, so one of the interesting
easily.
things I had to deal with is I had issues with perfectionism. So a lot of things I wouldn't start because if I couldn't do it, then why was I going to do it?
I'm not going to do it.
Or I wouldn't share it with the world because it wasn't perfect. And, working with a therapist, it's like, that's shame. It's not perfectionism, that's shame. It's not even that you're worried about people's reactions. You're worried about the shame that comes with if it's not right. You feel like you did something wrong. And it was interesting to think about it in the sense that, it's a trauma from when you're like, it's always like overbearing mother or this or that. Well, it's generational, right? It's the trauma maybe your parents put on you, that kind of pressure. And you're really reacting. You're really learning something and taking a generational trauma and then putting your own spin on it. Like when I thought of it that way, it's crazy. I mean, it's just, I don't even know where to go with that. It's crazy. But I thought that was interesting, your thoughts. I can't think we don't have any free will, but I also understand, well, let's talk about it before, right? Like, you're a part of everything. I understand momentum and inertia. The more life moves on, the more you move with it, and you have a certain lane or a certain way of doing things, and then it gets harder to break this cycle. But I feel like that breaking the cycle is a conscious effort that is free will. I mean, this guy's point was like, it wasn't. It was just all the chemical reactions that led up.
That might be a bit extreme. I think you're free willingly going with the flow and letting it get out of control. And then you're using your free will to gain control. But at the end of the day, no one's using it against you. It's just, it's easier to live on autopilot. And that's something I would refer as autopilot at that point. When your subconsciousness is just doing its thing organically and your conscious aspect is going along with it. You know, your subconscious is triggered. You're consciously projecting it out or reacting. You're letting the subconsciousness take over the system, and that's autopilot. You still have free will, and no one's taking away your free will necessarily. You are actively tossing it in the air or neglecting it.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think you toss it away or you neglect it. But that's also part of not living in the moment. You can't do that if you're aware of the moment you're in, but you can do that if you're elsewhere. And most people live, I always say most people live in the future or they live in the past. And the only way you can correct, I mean, it's okay to look to the past as a learning experience, but it's over. Like, you can't relive it all the time. And the future, obviously, that's important too. But if you're taking care of the present, you're more likely to take care of the future. The future just kind of can take care of itself a little. Not easy to do, but.
Oh, yeah. It's holding consciousness on your life at that point. Being consciously aware, I think, does mean you're in the moment. It's not just aware of the past, aware of the future, but you're trying to bring it all together as this trifecta a little bit. With the healing, the goal planning, the living part, you kind of need all of it a little bit.
Sometimes I feel like we're going through something too, because we live, comparatively speaking, to the past, you know, the people who made up these myths or started them or the oral tradition. I mean, it was a lot harder back then, right? You had to hunt your own food. You had to grow your own crops. You worked because you had to, right? I mean, now it's different. Our natural instinct is toward what do they call it, like the lizard brain or whatever you want, a reptile brain. We have all these luxuries that afford us to think or not use the body we were given the way it was supposed to be. I mean, this is the first time in history, when you think about it, that being heavy is actually more of a sign of not having wealth than the opposite, right? Like, because you have access to shitty food.
Funny, yeah.
Is what it comes down. You eat shitty food because you don't have access to good food.
It's not just like royalty or the upper ups who might be slightly overweight. It's not a sign of wealth anymore.
Yeah, and I think about that. I'm like, wow, the society's gotten really weird when you think about it.
Yeah, like women used to want to have their hair lightened, but they'd wear large hats so it wouldn't get their skin. They didn't want to be dark colored skin or get tans because it meant you were working out in the sun. Yeah, and they didn't want to be associated with people like that, and it was just kind of goofy. And now here we all are, like,
let's get a spray tan.
Tan sucks. I need a better tan.
That's abundance, I guess, right? I mean.
But I guess the luxury part switched over. Now we all want to like enjoy this side and have a tan.
Yeah, now it's definitely changed. No, but I think that all plays into the psyche, you know.
It very much does, yeah.
And then I get it too with mythology, the stories, and then finding meaning, especially when you were just trying to survive, you know. And now it's kind of like the opposite. You got to find meaning in a different way. It's something we're still adjusting to.
I think we're definitely going through another hero phase here soon, if not now, with a good percentage of people. But you can't just merely exist and be just lazy humans. You know, it does cause mental health issues. You get lost in where you're at. Some of our religions are very lazy, even. So it's like just this easy, lazy, fast food living. Like, you know, religion is fast food almost, in the sense you just order, you know, your salvation, or you order this or you order that, and you just have it all, you know. And what are we really doing? I was saying this earlier with another friend. I was like, at the end of the day, I feel like we're just all being lazy.
Yeah.
Like, humans civilizations before us, they had all the accommodations at their fingertips. They were not lazy. They were extremely resourceful. They created very big, amazing stories that we'll still talk about now. What is our era? What is our story besides technology advances and accommodation? Maybe?
I had a weird theory. Actually, I wrote something years ago about that, and it was kind of like, it was just thinking out loud about it, though, that maybe our evolutionary path was to bring about machines. It was technology. And maybe that's the human story, is to evolve into that. And then you hear all the AI stuff, and I'm like, uh-oh, it's Terminator 2, man.
I know. And it's funny because there's movies on this. And I always say sci-fi, people who write sci-fi books or movies, especially back with the good ones, they really knew their history on a cosmetic level or a universal level. Because, like, really interesting. But yeah, there's the one where they got the aliens and the AI and all that. And like, there's this huge ordeal. I haven't watched it much. I understand the main basics. But, it's the idea that this has been repeated, maybe not on this planet before, but there is even universal history lessons that come about, which I love universal history, not just Earth history. So I do my best to try to resource universal history. Makes me think sometimes maybe some of those libraries that were destroyed long ago actually held some more history lessons on some of the cultures that were beyond Earth. But I feel like this has definitely happened before, if not on our planet, other planets. And we are trying, I think we knew the history at one point, and now I think it's just like lost, destroyed, and we're totally repeating it in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't help that the people who write are the winners of history.
Yeah. It's all perspective. Can't get just data.
Yeah, it's not like it's by somebody independent. Usually it's somebody with
an emotional attachment to
I mean,
it.
even the people now, you'll see it more. I mean, the atrocities and stuff like that. It's not empirical. It's an emotional attachment to that side of it too. Yeah, I do wonder that though. Like, what was in that library? What books have been lost?
What I think about the most now, the Vatican has 27 miles worth of bookshelf space.
Really?
That is private and not open to the public. I want to know what the hell they scavenged through all of this lost context, and why can't we have it open to the public? 27 miles worth of bookcases? And I'm not saying 20 miles in diameter, just out of all the square inches of shelf and book.
That's crazy.
That's a pretty big library.
Who got to read that? Who gets to read that?
Only the Vatican. I don't know.
The guys in weird,
not us.
The weird outfits and stuff like that.
Yeah, we definitely do not get access to that.
Yeah, that's wild.
I hear it's underground or in like a safe space, very extremely private and well secluded. Yeah. When we know that people who go searching for history and, they dig in the earth and they're looking for stuff, they still are finding parts of these libraries and caves that were like preserved, but they're in really bad shape. To find stuff now in our day of age, like so torn up and terrible and been through so much weather, like an environment, like these are like in terrible shape. But to know that there is a library that still exists today, and like I'm sure Africa has stuff too, because like God, Africa is a motherland of all the good history and the ancient stuff.
Cradle of civilization.
They got some good shit, and I think they preserve a lot intentionally, because I know there's some really ancient spiritualistic places there. I hear the Ark of the Covenant still hanging out in Africa too. And like, I've heard I've read, I cannot remember the man's name, but like maybe early 1900s, he went over there to see it twice. It had radioactive elements coming off of it. And like the people who were guarding it usually died within X amount of years because they were around it so much. So I was like, oh, so like it's a radioactive box with 3 items in it.
Yeah.
Interesting. How does that even exist on the planet? And it's been disappeared for a long time, but a few people have claimed to have been allowed to go, and it's like deep in a jungle on a sacred land being guarded, apparently. But when you hear stories like this, you're like, okay, parts of history still do exist. They're just not for the public.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, governments all the time do it, right? They have so much top secret information. Every once in a while, it's like drips and drabs, but...
Like a little crumb to make it hungry for more.
I do. Yeah, I wonder. people who have certain clearance, what the hell they know, you know?
Right.
What goes on there?
If I ever go to the Vatican to visit, I'm probably going to
try
get
to break
arrested
it.
because I can't help but snoop
I
around.
I wonder if they're like in those type of, what do they call them? Like those vaults that are a certain temperature and they have to try to keep them from getting corroded. Like the light's very low and there's a certain light that they use.
They got to be like cooler weather, but not too
Right.
cold.
Yeah. There's like a
but
certain temperature.
no, like zero moisture and stuff.
Yeah. I've seen that.
I would imagine the whatever library that's private with the Vatican is probably one of those, because I know it's kind of under the property from what I've heard in the past, and which would make sense because it's something like a vault, basically, like a very large vault library of whatever books and things they could have gathered throughout all the pillaging and the wars. They were lucky to get what they got, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Because
I would think even recent.
it's like bits and scraps, I'm sure of it.
Like even recent history, like World War II, you look at and how much artwork and how much was lost.
They deliberately attacked and destroyed it.
Yeah, I mean, that was part of the control, right? To destroy all the books and the artwork and the history. I mean, art is a part of history
The culture.
and tells you a story about culture, which is sad.
Yeah. They didn't want it to be relatable. And we've been doing that for like all of mankind, basically. Our war experiences have never been nice. When we destroy, we destroy.
Mm-hmm.
Man does not mess around.
Well, it's more scary now because the weapons we have I don't know.
Destroy the whole planet.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I look at some things and I'm like, just looking at history, it's kind of a scary time right now. It's probably like to me, I don't want to sound like, but it's like, I'm like, it's 1936, 1937 real. All over, except now we have weapons, you know, when you look at the stuff that's going on with Russia and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And, you know, just inequality and things like that. That's usually the recipe. Nationalism.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, at the core, a lot of the times, it's not just politics. Some of these countries, not all, but some of them are definitely more like religious based, and they're still arguing over their place in that too. It's just like division across the board completely. And it's like, we are literally going to destroy this planet over politics and religion.
Yeah. I mean, I try to look at the deeper and you'll see, I talk about it all the time. You have a nationalistic element that builds in this country, but it's all over the place. And then you have the religious elements and things like that. But at the end of the day, it comes down to like something's wrong in society for common people. And they know it and they just don't know how to express it.
It's very frustrating to be in those spaces, which I'm sure if we all reconnected with mythology a little.
Yeah, I think sometimes though now we're just like too smart for our own good. Whereas I think most people look at mythology, that's all horseshit. You know, they don't see the meaning.
Very, very unrelatable, right. Yeah.
And they don't see, you know, like I'm always like, God damn, I mean, Marvel movies are based on a lot of that mythology when you think about it, right?
Like in a modern day twist.
That's all they are is some kind of weird modern twist on the mythologies.
I love it. It's inspirational. Yeah. How do we get people to tap back into that organically within themselves?
It's going to be so hard. I don't know. I like to think that I think sometimes you see a lot of the problems too that occur now is because I shouldn't say we have too much knowledge. We're just learning what to do with the knowledge. Like there's an awareness that we're living the wrong way. That's why you'll see a lot of the problems. It's just that people don't know how to express what that is a lot of times. I think we're starting to get to a point, though, where my fear is always like, how many people have to die before we realize that we're organized the wrong way? You know, do we have to have a nuclear war and lose a few billion people and say, shit, this is fucked up. Yeah. What happened? And we should be living I don't know.
I agree. I think we like to hyper focus on a lot of the details without maybe relaxing and seeing a bigger picture, which would probably provide some insights on maybe problem solving in a more naturalistic way. And I'm not really a fan of governments these days. I'm not saying I don't like the idea of having a government. I just feel like when it's so wrapped up tight, like a spring, that's how I'm feeling about politics lately. And I think people are still trying to rely on a system that is obviously broken, looking for help or truth or some balance from it. And it's It's not going to be the mass collective system that gives them their balance. It'll be their internal first. Then when the internal of X amount of percentage of people start to balance out, then you'll start seeing it on a mass collective scale.
Well, I think like politics is kind of funny sometimes too, because people will talk about like jobs or something like that. And I'm like, you have some control over your job. like, oh, this president didn't get enough jobs. And it's like, well, don't you have some control over where you work? I mean, it's a system, right? Society is a system. And it's actually like the idea of democracy is, I think, a good idea in general. Like when you think about it at the core.
At the core, yeah.
Well, you go back to like Socrates, Greeks and stuff like that. I know Socrates didn't love democracy. If you read him, sometimes like what he was saying about democracy, you'll be like, shit. He thought one of the problems would be like, for example, you should be an experienced or educated type of person, because once you realized you could just vote in as opposed to like somebody who should be there, but there's another guy who's like a sweet shop owner who's like, I could just give you free sweets. People would be like, okay, that sounds better.
Like manipulated and stuff.
Yeah, like it's easy to manipulate masses. But I think the idea is there. Humans have organized themselves terribly. Just that's what it comes down to. We organize ourselves so wrong. It all comes down to power dynamics.
I agree. And I think we make decisions like that out of fear or insecurity at the core. It's always an emotion that makes us make the wrong choice.
Yes, I say that too, right? So there's an interesting theory I heard, and it was talking about people who make predictions, whether it's an economist or somebody. And they said the reason why they're wrong most of the time is because they look at things from a logical perspective, and human beings do not act rationally whatsoever. And when you think of it that way, it's probably totally true.
It makes sense.
Right? I mean, how many times, how many fucking purchases have I made that I was like, that was a bad moment. I don't know what happened there.
Like, I'm feeling sad, depressed, probably shouldn't be doing this, but I'm going to do it.
I start rationalizing in my head. I was like, sure, I'll just drop 500 on this thing. Why not? I mean, I deserve it. I worked hard. But yeah, I thought that was like an interesting way to look at it. The difference between us and primates or animals is not that they don't have emotions, but we're too run by our emotions. Like,
we take whatever they're going through and we somehow extreme it as humans in some ways, because there's a lot of similarities. Animals are emotional, they're instinctive. We are a part of the same ecosystem, but we somehow have a certain part of our evolution that is definitely different, makes us smarter, but almost more retarded at the same time. Interesting breed on this planet. The most interesting breed.
Oh, that's true. We definitely are. And, it's also interesting. We're very lucky in some ways, right? If the dinosaurs didn't go extinct, if the comet or the meteor didn't hit the Earth, we wouldn't be here. We got lucky, right? We derived from carbon. I think we derived from the water. Not mistaken. Most of it came out of the water. I'm going to have to fact check that.
It makes sense.
That when you think about it, our hierarchy can be there, right? Like the dinosaurs would have been wrong.
Well, but we are a very adaptive species. Maybe we've been more thinned out.
But, you change one thing in history and something doesn't happen.
Because they would have been eating us, but some of them.
Yeah. And it was also different back then. I know, like, one of the reasons they were bigger was there was just more oxygen.
So it was more of a chemical thing or something that had affected the atmosphere to create the space for people, basically. I think the flood story in the Bible talked about something like that, like had to do with the atmosphere. People live shorter days slowly, and I think we also progressed to be smaller. But there's obviously other stories that explain giants in a metaphysical kind of.
Well, giants are. I thought I read some of those stories, like with giants, would be people finding dinosaur bones and not knowing about dinosaurs.
I could see that.
Right. Like, so, I mean,
I very much could see that.
I think we only really started digging up fossils in the late 1800s that we started figuring that out.
Well, there's a lot of stories of people physically coming across alive giants, though, too.
Yeah.
I like pre-flood history a lot. There's a lot of pre-flood history is interesting. And I do think it inspired some of the earliest mythology. because it was just like really out there. But I think people were speaking from their perspective of imagination, which is very different for our culture of today because, language evolves. But no, they were definitely talking about like giants, you got the angels and the demons, which I view these words very like limited terms or terminology. Because I think what we call like an angel or a demon is like a very broad, very large lane. And just the same as saying there's many gods, same idea. But there was really interesting history before the flood. And that's always caught my attention. Even though I own a lot of books on these things and I'm like have the concept to read it someday, I still haven't made it through my reading list.
That's my problem. I start the problem is I read too many books at once then.
Same.
Because I start reading and then I'm excited and I'm like, this other book looks really interesting.
Yeah, or it starts out slow and you're like, boring.
Yeah, well, I'm like, I don't know if I'm smart enough to get this concept.
That's how I feel about astrophysics. Every time I read science books, I'm like, I have a couple Stephen Hawking books that I had to read a couple times, and I'm like, I feel like I'm just putting it into my subconsciousness to have it kind of chew on it and bring about whatever it needs to from that.
Oh yeah, I feel that way about science a lot.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes I feel like I'm reading it and I understand the concept, and then I'll try to explain it, and I'm like, I don't understand it.
You're like, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. I love quantum physics. I love astrophysics a lot. I'm quite the amateur, though, and I am not the one to necessarily ask.
That's I love reading about string theory and stuff like that, but forget about it. Get me past the third dimension, and fuck are we talking about? What is that? What's past this?
Gotta go back to basics. Read, what's the Flatland?
Yeah, it's
not that it's basics, but it sure is cute. It makes sense.
I know. But it's funny. You read some of that stuff and you're like, people will call, somebody, I don't know, for lack of a better term, somebody who's spiritual crazy. But I'm listening to some of these physicists and what they're talking about, at an atomic level or at a cosmic level. And I'm like, this guy could be just straight telling me bullshit. Oh, it sounds so out there.
I love the fact that science is stepping into these lanes.
It is
it's so nice, though.
It's kind of bridging that gap, right? I mean, science is catching up to a lot of these unexplainable things. And honestly, I mean,
about time.
Where it's going to go eventually, who knows?
I think it'll match up very well I do have high hopes for the future generation. I think because we're experiencing in the last 100 years just a lot of political bullshit. We've had their ups and downs just on a worldwide level, but it's been going on for a long time, but I really think we're hitting a tipping point in that, and it's going to start swinging the other way.
Well, here's where
we cannot go any farther in one direction that we're going now. It has to go the other way.
I think a lot of the turmoil is the tipping point. However, this goes back to the awareness thing. You might not see the tipping point in your lifetime because it's just such a small amount. It's so infinitesimal time when you think about it, right? I mean, it could take 200 or 300 years. Now, in time, when you talk about of all time, that's nothing. That's nothing. It's a snap of a finger. For us, it's
everything.
Yeah. And I think people also don't recognize that because they think of things in terms of their own their own just little itty bitty chunk of time.
Yeah. No, and I agree with that. That's why we need to be more on a large scale perspective. So we need to stop. And I always say there's a moment to zoom in and zoom out. But I think when it comes to things like this, you have to zoom out. You can't just be hyper focused on the zoom in. It's very stressful because we have a lot going on in our culture, just worldwide for a while now. And it does take a while. But I really think when I look at it, even as on an astrology level, generations that are being born right now with their Neptune placement, where it's okay, they're going to have a very large self-awareness level with that placement. And they're going to be the ones who are not going to threaten to bomb each other, but to take a different approach through their own personal self-realization. And I have some hope for that generation. The Alpha One has that. And we're prepping them with all of our healing the generational crap, bringing out the subconsciousness, our new science. If you think about it, it's all prepping this generation to.
Yeah, I think when I look at like Gen Z or the Alpha you're talking about, they're different, you know?
Yeah.
I'm on the tail end of Gen X. I mean, I guess you're a millennial.
I'm a millennial, yeah.
Yeah, but I think something started with those groups.
Yeah, we did some stuff.
I think we're just like, well, we're part of the latchkey kid generation where it's like, I was like the first generation of the working parents where you're left home to your own devices.
To like watch TV, eat dinner meals, and take care of
Yeah,
yourself.
I make myself microwave meal and make sure you lock the door.
Independence, yeah.
That's it. Yes, it's a little different. I think what you see is the changing of the guard now at this point. And you could tell the older generation that, unfortunately, I think that older generation is still in charge. And that's where you're seeing the turmoil, the intergenerational battles.
They're controlling the politics around the world for the most part still.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. When they get into power. And that's why I wonder, too, like, I don't know. I hate to be like ageist or whatever.
But it makes
Should
sense
70-year-olds and 80-year-olds.
when you look at generational characteristic traits and how certain ones are no longer relatable to the younger. They always have a minimum age, but is there a maximum?
Yeah, I do wonder that too. And then if you don't want to say it's ageist, I look at it from the perspective of that means an older generation is making decisions for the generation they're making decisions based on their generation 40 years ago for the generation coming up in the next 40 years. It doesn't make any sense to me.
No, I totally agree with that. Because, and it's funny, but like even looking at it through like astrology view, each generation is followed or categorized by the, Neptune is like the main one. So when you look at Neptune as its 14 to 15 year space gaps and how it doesn't just affect the individual, but the mass collective of that era, they're very different personalities.
Yeah.
It's really not fair to have that be going on because at this point, obviously we can see that there's much going on in the world right now with like even Russia, Ukraine. And I'm sure that's still going on. I don't watch the news. I try to avoid it.
Yeah, it's still, there's things going on.
I'm positive that was not concluded in a year. And then you got Israel and Palestine again for like how many thousands? They've been fighting for a while. One country invests in itself and thrives. The other one invests in war and conflict, and the people are angry. It's politics
it's also
again.
Though.
How they treat.
It's also different, I think.
And religion.
I don't even think it's country to country anymore. I think it's corporations. Now you got like the multi-conglomerate corporations. I mean, a lot of the stuff is like, you want to talk about Ukraine. It's like, yeah, we send weapons, but I read that, Lockheed Martin and all these people, they're like, let's test out these new weapons. It's not our people getting killed. Let's try these out so we could, make another $20 billion for our stockholders and stuff. So, and I think that's where the younger generation sees the bullshit. But that's where I love them, even like talking to my kids sometimes, like that's all stupid bullshit you're telling me. But, they're connected in a different way too. Like, my older son plays video games. He was telling me about a kid in Russia that he was playing a video game with. He's talking about the war. So he's actually getting a perspective
on a one-on-one individual
reality, that's totally different than what you would see, whatever's curated on television.
I love that way better. Because, I don't watch the news, but I do have friends around the world at this point. And one of my friends, he's Jewish. He's a business partner of mine, and he's in UK. He was talking about some of the Palestinian refugees coming in and the anger they were feeling, how they were giving him and his family dirty looks because they were Jewish and they're well off. And he was going to Starbucks and he's like, I wasn't trying to make anyone feel bad, but I really wanted my coffee. And I was like, it really does give you a very different perspective when you're talking to people on their personal level versus listening to the news express like the political perspective and why it may be justified. I feel bad for all sides.
Yeah, I see that too. But I see that there's more of awareness right now. So when you're talking about like that conflict, and I won't get too deep into that, like it's very, very, people have very strong opinions about it. That people are more aware of the human toll of it more than, you're talking about like the state of Israel or like the government of Israel versus Hamas. No, I don't think many people are siding with that part of it. They're talking about the human element of it and, collateral damage and what people would call collateral damage, which is just a
Disgusting.
nice way of talking about killing people. That's all that is. Yeah.
Like, it's just data versus people and human families and lives. It all really sucks. I'm not a big fan of politics in the current day form because I feel like it sacrifices the everyday person very willingly, very quickly. And even corporations, but also like even religions do the same. So like those are three main things that all come into play in decision making of war. You got your religion, your politics, and your corporation.
It's it's all power down. It's a hierarchy.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, do the people actually care enough to want to go through it? Or is it just the rich people who are willing to do it?
They do put a lot of everyday people because they do have a choice in who they elect. They have a choice as far as looking at it from a perspective of, I guess my weird thing is, like, I've always thought it was strange since I was a kid that is like this made up thing. It's just made up. It's a unit of measurement. That's all it is. And the only reason it has value is because everybody chose to believe in it. And you had to talk about like Africa or something. I mean, there's tribes still that have this stuff. They live like Native Americans did back in the day. If everybody just decided to not believe in money tomorrow, it wouldn't exist. The power wouldn't exist. Like, I never understood it. It's such a weird, I mean, I guess everything's like that. I said that to somebody. She was like, well, that's the law too. And I was like, well, I guess you're right. But at least the law, like, it's a way to organize your society. Like, these are the rules you have to be. Money is just like a tool of power. Like, I understand the concept. Yeah, well, I understood the concept of it as far as like,
like an energy exchange. Yeah.
Yeah, bartering. But then now, like, economically, it's so out of whack.
Yeah, could you imagine being like, when it first started up, people are like, here's a coin. It had to have been gold because that would be the only thing that would really get people's value, maybe.
Yeah.
Like,
bartering made more sense.
Thank you for farming all day. Versus like, here's some corn or some food from the farm. And
the barter system
sustainable
made sense to me, but I think that
to introduce money must have been like chaos.
Yeah. Well, so it was very tied to where you live. There used to be a lot of competing coins, I guess you could say, or money. Grain would be like something that competes against. It's almost like the way the stock market works now, right? I mean, all that stuff actually does have some weird value to it. It's just so fucked up that it's tied in manipulating the markets and stuff. I think it's weird to me, but the start of this country has a lot to do with all the states, at least the Constitution has a lot to do with the fact that every state had its own money. Some of them had different types of versions of their own money. And the Europeans didn't want to trade with us at some point because it was like you could get something and then be bankrupt depending on the state or where you were. The state didn't have to do anything about it. And because of that, I mean, the honest to God's truth was they were just getting together to reform the Articles of Confederation. That's all those 55 men got together to reform it, and they were not tasked with making a constitution. That's exactly what they did. Madison and Hamilton pushed that, but that's why it's weird to me too, because we get so like crazy with the Constitution, and it's kind of like a renegade document, though. They weren't supposed to. Again, that's a belief system, right? I mean, the Constitution is a belief system. I shouldn't say that out loud. People give you weird looks when you start saying that's a renegade. It's a renegade document.
It makes sense, though, and it, like, in a sense,
yeah. So
the whole thing must have been. I couldn't imagine being alive at that time, but it's just a lot when you view history on details of that time specifically. There's so much going on. But then, like, at the same time, I love King Solomon a lot. He has very interesting history, and I believe he was one of the first who set up international banking before it was officially international banking.
Yeah.
And he was also, like, so he had a lot of stuff. And I think he wrote Ecclesiastes personally, because it's unnamed, but obviously it's got his name all over it, if you think about how he talks. And he was like, what was me? What were all my actions? You're going to basically remember everything I've done for the rest of humanity.
Yeah.
We're like, oh, yeah. Yep, 700 wives, interbedding with 700. All those cultures, his worldwide connection, because each wife was basically a contract. You had a lot going on. I always take it back historically. We have a lot of our modern day things in society. Like, where did it start in the first place? It went from being villages or small estates to going on a very large scale.
Yeah.
And he really pulled in a lot of his own personal influence on it too, which is crazy. Because banking back then was just horseback.
Oh, yeah. I think it was more, well, that was part of like the knight, when you get to like the Knights Templar and stuff like that, right? They were protecting really rich people traveling.
And that still comes from King Solomon.
Well,
because he was, before the King's Arthur's table was dubbed King's Arthur Table, or the Round Table.
It's weird, right? Like you think about how banking evolved, and that's actually like national banking was really just to protect people en route to somewhere else. And think about how history's influenced by that. Like when you think about the Knights Templar, you're thinking of the Crusades and that. And it's everything intertwines so much. Weird when you start looking. That's what my friend said. It's a web. Exactly. It all goes together.
That's why if you love history, and it's always the coolest mystery. It's sad that history is...
Yeah, I agree. And we're always, it's always changing. It's always in motion.
One thing I want is my own personal influence. If I could historically influence the world around me, I would like to influence it as a voice of the mass collective through its emotional phases of the experiences we're going through now. I think there's people who do that, and they might not be doing it in their life and get recognition for it, but they do afterwards.
Yeah, well, that's the way it works a lot, right? And a lot of times it's the person who's crazy while they're living, right? Like later on, they get the recognition. Well, I'm going to wrap it up because we went really long, although I could talk about this forever, so we'll have to figure out something again. I don't even know what to call this because we covered I think we covered everything in civilization. So,
humanity at the core.
Yeah, I think so
Humanity experience.
I think we peeled back the layers. We peeled it like an onion.
Yeah, we're like, there's many layers to it. It was fun.
Yeah. Please come back again. We'll chat about something. It's fun.
Enjoy your evening. Thank you for having me back.
Thank you for coming back. Have a good night.
Thanks to everyone who took some time out of their day today to listen. The With Jay Burke Show is available wherever you find your favorite podcast, or go directly to jayburkshow.podbean.com and subscribe to get the latest episodes. I know it may not always be a straight line, but I hope we'll see you again to take the journey and escape a while for thoughtful excursions into the world of ideas across politics, technology, pop culture, and all realms of civic life. See you soon.